Hello and welcome to my video all about how to make a huge sewing table with custom storage underneath. The way that I've laid this video out is that first I'm going to do a quick run through of how to make the craft table, and then I'm going to do a slower and more detailed tutorial afterwards. Okay, so first I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I came to make this craft table. Recently I was lucky enough to be able to turn a second bedroom into my very own craft room, and something I've always wanted is a very big sewing table. I enjoy doing a lot of different crafts, and anyone who's into crafting will know it takes up a lot of space. And another thing that craftspeople will definitely relate to is a very severe lack of storage space, especially for awkward items. Because I make my own greetings cards, I have a paper creaser, which is A3 size, an A3 guillotine, a few card boxes that are over 80 centimeters long, and I've also got the parts of a tabletop loom, which again are very long and thin and awkward things to store. You can't put them on normal shelves or in normal cupboards. So I set about designing a table that would fit into the space I've got available in my room, would store all of these awkward items, won't take too long to build, and I also need to be able to build it without any fancy power tools. My boyfriend, who is going to be helping me with this build, has a few power tools but nothing fancy. In order to keep the cost and the weight, and in particular the time that it takes to build this, down to a minimum, I'm going to be buying a few of the parts from IKEA. So one of the 3 storage units, the tabletops, and some inserts are going to be bought as flat pack. Of course, the custom built units are going to be built from scratch. Because we've never made furniture before, this is going to be a fairly basic and simple build, and will be a really good starter project for Woodwork newbies. So I really hope that you enjoy this project as well, and maybe even give it a go yourself. I will leave a link beneath this video to direct you to a written tutorial I've made, where hopefully you will find any extra information you need. I already knew that I wanted to incorporate a matte white Kallax unit from IKEA into my design, so I knew that the units that I was going to make would also be finished with a matte white paint, since I wanted all the units to match. I therefore didn't need to consider if the wood was pretty or had a nice grain, because it was all going to be painted over. So I chose MDF because it gives a smooth and even finish, and also it's cheaper than the solid wood alternatives. I ended up buying 2 large sheets of MDF from B&Q, which is a DIY store in the UK, and one of those sheets was 25mm thick, and the other was 12mm thick. And I also bought a 3mm thick piece of hardboard. I had to go to B&Q to get all the pieces cut out for me, which was a huge help and also vital because I don't have any other way of cutting pieces of wood that are that big. Obviously, if you have a track or table saw, you could cut the pieces out yourself. Luckily, the assistant at B&Q was very patient and cut all of the pieces millimetre perfect, so I didn't need to trim any of them or redo any of them. In terms of costings, I estimate that this table cost me around £350 in total, with £72 being spent on the wood, although to be fair I had quite a bit left over as well, £150 on the tabletops, so there could be some savings to make there if you went for a cheaper option, £110 on the Kallax and inserts, and then a little bit spent on paint and other bits and pieces. The tools and many of the other items we already had, such as the router, the glue and the polyfiller. So obviously if you don't have those items already, it's going to cost you a little bit more. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly summarise how we made this table. Firstly, we took our 25mm MDF upright pieces, which are going to form the sides of the units we're making, and we cut dados into them. Dados are basically grooves or slots, and we're going to cut them with a router. We used a straight 12mm router bit to cut these dados because they're going to hold our 12mm MDF shelves. We used a long piece of leftover MDF as our straight edge, which guides the router across the wood. We cut the dados into the two narrower uprights at the same time to make sure they were both identical. And we cut the dados into the larger uprights individually. We ended up with 4 uprights, each with 2 dados cut into them. We decided that we were going to attach these uprights along the bottom edge to the base using wooden dowels and wood screws. We made a small jig out of scrap wood, and we used this to drill 2 holes into the bottom of each upright piece, one at each end. These holes are to accommodate the wooden dowels. We did this for all 4 uprights, and then we used the same jig to add holes into the base sections. So we drilled a hole into each corner of the base pieces, and then carefully inserted the wooden dowels into these holes using a hammer. We did this for the base piece of the other unit as well. And then, even though I didn't capture it on camera, I followed the exact same steps to add holes for the wood screws as well. So I drilled 2 holes into the bottom edges of the uprights and 4 holes into each base piece, each of these holes being 1 or 2 inches away from where we put the holes for the dowels. Then it's time to put your breathing mask on and your extractor fan and do some sanding and painting. We sanded all of the pieces, but at this point we only painted the inside surfaces of the uprights. To do this, we masked the dados using masking tape and then applied 2 coats of MDF primer. Then it was time to assemble the units. So we lined up the dowels with the dowel holes in the uprights and slotted the shelves into the dados. Once we were happy with how the pieces went together, we then inserted 4 wood screws into the underside of each base to securely hold it all in place. We then wanted to put a couple of vertical shelf dividers into the wider unit. We applied a little bit of wood glue to the top and bottom edges of the first divider, and then used scrap wood guides and some mitre clamps to hold it in place whilst the glue dried. Once that was dry, we glued the other divider into place, this time using the scrap wood guides and 2 long clamps. As an extra step, we added a little bit of watered down polyfiller to the front edges of the units and where the MDF pieces join. This was just to give a smoother finish. Then we finished painting both units with the MDF primer. On one of the units I wanted to add a hardboard backing, so I covered this board with wallpaper that I had left over, and then I added it onto the back of the wider unit. I'd already left a little bit of a recess at the back of this unit in order to accommodate this hardboard, so it just slotted in nice and easily and fit flush with the back of the uprights. The third unit to form this craft table is a flat pack Kallax from IKEA. So I set about putting this together, but I stopped short of attaching the top piece. This is because I first need to drill 4 holes into it in order to attach 2 wooden blocks to the top later on. So I used a jig to drill a hole into each corner of this piece. And I also drilled 2 corresponding holes into each of the wooden blocks I'll be adding later on. I then finished putting the Kallax together by attaching this drilled top piece. And I also painted the wooden blocks with MDF primer. Then I positioned all 3 units in my craft room exactly how I want them. And I attached the wooden blocks onto the top of the Kallax using long wood screws and washers. And then the final step is to add the tabletops. As I bought the 2 tabletops, all I had to do was attach them together to make sure that they don't move apart. I didn't attach the tabletops directly to the units because they're heavy enough to not move easily anyway. So I cut out a couple of pieces of plywood and drilled a hole at each end. Luckily, the tabletops I bought already had screw plates embedded into the underside. So I simply chose wood screws that fit into the screw plates and will go only halfway through the thickness of the tabletops. I then screwed the pieces of plywood onto the tabletops, one at each end, so that they straddle the central join. And that holds the tabletops together. And that's my craft table completed. And now it's time to just fill it full of lovely stuff. I'm now going to do a slower, more detailed tutorial in case you want to follow along with the process more closely. I think the design and the calculations part of the whole process is the most important, because if you get the sizes wrong now, obviously the end result isn't going to be very successful. To begin with, I needed to work out how high I wanted the table to be, considering I will mostly be standing up to use it, and also how big overall I want it to be. I also needed to measure all of the large and awkward items that I wanted to store in these units, so I could work out how big the shelves need to be. Once you know the sizes of what you want to store in the units, and you know the size limits of your units, then you can get on with designing them. I'm going to be making 2 of the 3 units from scratch, and obviously these will be custom built for my personal specifications. So obviously when you design your units, they're going to be a different size and shape to mine. This first diagram shows a wide but quite shallow unit, which will house my paper creaser at the top, my guillotine in the centre, and then at the bottom I wanted to be able to have 2 IKEA Kallax inserts. And for these to fit, the opening needs to be 335 by 335 millimeters exactly. The narrow gap in between those openings is just what's left over, but they would be big enough for A4 card or paper. As you can see, it's mostly made out of 12mm MDF, but the uprights are 25mm MDF. One important thing to note is that on this unit only, I will be adding a hardboard backing. I have therefore made the top 2 shelves and the shelf dividers 5mm shallower than the other sections. This will leave a 5mm gap at the back where the hardboard back will sit. This shows the other unit that I'm going to make from scratch, which is a narrow but deep unit that will house my 3 long card boxes. As with the other unit I'm making, the sides are 25mm MDF and the shelves are 12mm MDF. And 5mm deep dados or grooves will be cut into the sides and will hold the shelves. This third diagram shows the pre-bought IKEA Kallax grid in grey, and then on top are the 2 blocks of 25mm MDF that I'm going to need to add. These wooden blocks are mostly to make the 770mm height of the Kallax up to the 850mm height that I want, but also to create more storage space in between these blocks that's long enough to house my loom pieces. So once you've designed all of the units and you've triple checked the measurements, it's time to get all of the wood pieces cut out. As I said before, you can go to B&Q or a similar store to get the wood cut for you. Or, of course, if you've got the equipment, you can cut the pieces yourself. Either way, it's a very good idea to make a cutting guide to work out how exactly you're going to cut those pieces out of one sheet of wood. The idea is that you work out how to most efficiently cut the wood, so that you have to make the fewest cuts, and also you waste the least amount of wood possible. And here you can see my cutting guides, with the sheet of 25mm MDF on the left, and the sheet of 12mm MDF on the right. The smallest sheets that I could fit all of the pieces onto measured 2440 by 1220mm. So there was a fair amount of leftover wood that I could use for practice runs, for jigs, and for other projects. Okay, so now we've got the pieces of wood all cut out, it's time to add the dados, which are basically grooves or slots that you cut into the sides of the units. I'm going to make the dados 5mm deep and 12mm wide, so I'm going to use a 12mm straight router bit. I'm going to be making 2 units, each with 2 shelves that require dados. So therefore, in each of the 4 upright pieces, I'm going to be cutting 2 dados. The important thing is that the sides of each unit are identical on the inside surface. Otherwise, the shelves won't go in smoothly and they might look a bit wonky. So my first piece of advice would be to label all the upright pieces. In my case, the 25mm pieces. You want to label, in pencil, the top, the bottom, the inside, the outside, the left and the right of all the wooden pieces, just to make it absolutely clear. If you don't have much woodworking experience, like us, you'll definitely want to do a few test runs on some scrap MDF. This is so you can practice getting a smooth slot cut into the wood, and also to work out where you need to position the router to get the dado in the correct place. You can see we made a quick sketch to work this distance out. In our case, the dado will be positioned 72mm from wherever we place our straight edge. The circle is the router, and at the top is a piece of scrap MDF wood that we were just using to practice on. We're going to be using this scrap piece of MDF as our straight edge, which will guide the router all the way across the wood in a straight line. You can buy a straight edge or use a clamp guide, or like us, you could just use a long piece of wood. But whatever you use, just make sure that it's long enough to span the width of the wood that you're cutting into. So once we were happy about where to position the router, we laid down 2 uprights of MDF next to each other, making sure that the top and bottom edges lined up perfectly. Then secure them in place with clamps. These 2 wooden pieces are the uprights, or the sides, of the wider unit that I'm making. And the reason that I'm cutting the dados into these pieces at the same time is to make sure that they're absolutely identical. So, working from my design and using the calculations that I just did on the whiteboard, I placed the scrap piece of wood, which acts as the straight edge, onto these pieces. And then, when I'm happy that it's perfectly positioned, I clamp it in place. And then it's finally time to use the router. First, put your breathing mask and face shield on, and then push the router up against the straight edge of the scrap piece of wood, and use that as a guide to cut all the way across the wooden pieces. Make sure that you don't cut too fast, otherwise the cut may not be smooth. Take particular care at the join between the 2 pieces of wood, because it's very easy for the router to wobble a little bit in this area, as we helpfully demonstrate. Then you just do exactly the same to cut any other dados you want in these wooden pieces. So because I want 2 shelves, I cut 1 more dado in these pieces, and that gave me 2 uprights that were identical on the inside surface. We then needed to cut dados into the uprights of the other unit, and these uprights are much larger, so we had to cut them individually rather than side by side. Because we didn't cut these uprights with the router at the same time, we had to make extra sure that we were placing the dados in the same places on each piece of wood. To help us make sure that we put the straight edge guide in the right place, we cut a scrap of wood to a length of 322mm. This is the distance away from the edge that the straight edge guide needs to be. And this length of wood cut to size just helps us check that it's in the right position. And then we just do the same steps as before. So we clamp the straight edge guide onto the wood piece and then cut with the router all the way across. We did this twice for each of these uprights. Once you've cut all of those dados, your shelves should fit into them snugly. And what we're going to work on now is joining all of these wood pieces together, using glue, dowels and screws. Okay, so now we need to think about how the uprights are going to join to the base pieces. We're going to do this by adding wooden dowels into the corners of the bases. And since these dowels will be mainly for alignment purposes, we're also going to put a wood screw into each corner to secure the pieces together. So in summary, that's a wood screw and a wooden dowel in each corner of the base. And these will go straight up through the base and into the centre of the edges of the upright pieces. So first we're going to add the holes for the wooden dowels in the bottom edges of the uprights. To make sure that we put the holes in the same place every time, we made a little jig out of scrap wood. This made sure that we would be drilling the hole in the centre of the edge and around 1 or 2 inches from the sides. Before you drill the holes for real, I would recommend doing a test run, just to make sure that the size of the hole that you're using is adequate for the wooden dowels you're using. You want the dowels to fit snugly, but not so tight that pushing the dowel into the wood would cause splitting. After a test run on some scrap wood, I decided that I would drill a 6mm hole for my 6mm wooden dowels. So I simply lined the edge of the jig up with the edge of the upright and drilled through the jig with my electric drill. I made 2 holes in the bottom edge of each upright. And even though I haven't got it on camera, I also did the same for the uprights of the other unit that I'm making. And then it's time to drill the corresponding holes in the corners of the base pieces. So we took the base piece for the wider unit and we balanced it on a couple of pieces of scrap wood on the floor. The reason we put it on the floor rather than on a table is because it's easier to drill down into something when it's placed lower. We used the same jig and again lined it up at the edge of the base. Then we used the same drill bit again to drill straight down into the corner of the base piece. We did this for all 4 corners. Then we inserted a wooden dowel into each of these holes and used a hammer to push it through. Make sure you have a piece of scrap wood under the hole when you do this so that it finishes flush with the bottom of the base piece. Again, I did the same steps for the base piece of the other unit as well. And then it was time to add more holes, this time to accommodate the wood screws that would securely fix the uprights to the bases. Unfortunately, the only photo I have of the wood screws is from a bit further along in the process. This photo shows the underside of the narrow unit, and you can see the dowels and the wood screws just about at each corner. We wanted to use 4 25mm posi drive wood screws for each unit, and we wanted each of these wood screws to be positioned alongside where the dowels have been placed. So at each corner there will be a dowel and a wood screw, with the wood screws being placed at least 1 inch away from the dowels and further away from the front or back edges. Again, this is something you should do a test run of in scrap wood before you drill the holes. How we did it was very much like how we drilled the holes for the dowels. We made a jig, although this time it was a bit longer, and we used it to drill pilot holes into each corner of the base and 2 holes into the bottom edge of each upright. We then enlarged the pilot holes in the base in order to make clearance holes. And now we can move on to painting and assembling. Because it's a lot harder to paint the insides of the units once they're assembled, we're going to do that bit now. So first you want to lightly sand all of the surfaces of your wooden pieces with a sanding block and sandpaper, particularly the edges which will be at the front of the units. Make sure to wear a breathing mask and safety specs, and also to have good ventilation. Then you thoroughly vacuum or wipe off all of the dust on the wood. You then mask the dados with masking tape and paint the inside surfaces of the uprights. I did this with 2 coats of matte white MDF primer. I originally planned to paint the units in the primer and then add a couple of layers of spray paint on top. However, the so-called white spray paint that I ordered turned out to be more of a cream colour, so I abandoned that. And to be honest, I really like the finish of the MDF primer, especially when it's applied with a paint roller, because it gives a really smooth and professional finish. Once the paint has dried, you can then assemble the units. First by slotting the shelves into the dados, and then lining the dowels up with the dowel holes in the uprights. Please note that if, like me, you are making a unit which will have a hardboard backing added to it, then the front edges of the shelves will need to line up with the front edges of the uprights. This will mean that at the back of this particular unit, the shelves will be recessed. Once you're happy that it all goes together like it should, then you can put a minimal amount of wood glue onto the shelf edges going into the dados, and maybe a dot of glue on the dowels. The pieces will fit very snugly, so there's not really too much need for glue. However, we just wanted to make sure it was all secure. Once the units were assembled, we then added the wood screws into the underside of the bases, so they go up through the base and into the uprights. Just make sure that you don't tighten the wood screws too much, as it is easy to strip the thread. Before we then painted the units, we did one extra step, which was to add a tiny amount of slightly watered down white polyfiller to the joins at the front of the units, i.e. where the shelves meet the uprights, and along the front edges of the shelves and the base. This was just to make a smoother look, as often MDF edges are difficult to create a smooth painted finish on. However, this is an optional step. We left the polyfiller to dry, gave it a quick sand and a wipe, and then moved on to painting the narrow unit, again applying 2 coats of matte white MDF primer. The reason we're not yet painting the wider unit is because we've still got to add some shelf dividers. If you're going to paint your units as well, I definitely recommend that you use a paint roller to apply the paint in order to create a smoother, more professional looking finish. And another advantage of using a paint roller is that it's quicker. I definitely found the painting bit to be the most time consuming bit of the whole process. Okay, so next we're going to add 2 vertical shelf dividers to the wider unit. We first made some guides out of a narrow piece of scrap wood, cutting it into 2 pieces that measured 335mm long, as this is how far the dividers need to be placed from the uprights. We used these guides to position one divider into the correct position in the unit, and then added wood glue along the top and bottom edges. We used mitre clamps to keep it in place, and then left the glue to dry. Then we glued the other divider into the unit, and this one needed a bit more creative thinking regarding the clamping, due to the small gap in between the dividers. We ended up taking the end pieces off our clamps and turning them around, so that we could then use them to push outwards, rather than squeeze wood pieces together. So we used the clamps to push from one side, and the scrap wood guides to push from the other side. And we also used a strategically placed speaker for support. Again, we then left the glue to dry before removing the clamps. We then followed the same steps for this unit as we did for the narrow unit, adding a little bit of polyfiller to the joins and the front edges, and then applying 2 coats of MDF primer with a roller. And then it was time to add the hardboard backing to this wider unit. So I put the piece of hardboard on the floor, making sure that it was the correct way up. And then I set about covering it with wallpaper. I had some wallpaper left over from when I decorated the craft room, so I thought it'd be nice to make it match. However, you can just paint the hardboard if you prefer, or cover it with a different type of decorative paper. In order to cover the hardboard, I needed to cut out 2 strips of the wallpaper, each a bit taller than the board. The first strip is easy to cut out because you can use any part of the pattern, but make sure that the second strip you cut out is the part of the pattern that will match up with the first strip, Pattern matching between the wallpaper strips down the centre line is very important. So once you have the two strips, double check that you have the board the correct way up, then measure and mark out the centre point of the board, at the top and the bottom. Then attach the wallpaper strips to the board so that they meet up at the centre point marks. You can use wallpaper paste or just glue to attach the paper to the board, but make sure that the wallpaper lies flat and is smooth with no bubbles. I only used wallpaper paste as I had some left over, but to be honest it was messy and awkward to use, so I would personally recommend that you use glue instead, perhaps a thin layer of slightly watered down PVA. Then, once the paste or glue is dry, use a utility knife or craft knife to carefully cut off the excess paper all the way around. I then used super glue on the back edges of the shelves to attach the hardboard to the back of the unit. You could use a different method of attaching it, such as nails, if you wanted. At this point, I also added 2 cupboard door inserts that I bought from IKEA. The third unit is one that I so far haven't worked on, and that's the flat pack Kallax from IKEA. So first, I needed to put it all together, except for the top section. I needed to add 4 holes to this top section before attaching it onto the Kallax. This is so that I'll be able to attach the supporting wooden blocks onto the top later on. I want the blocks that will be attached to the top of this Kallax to be placed as far apart as possible. So I positioned each block so that the face lined up with the short edge of the Kallax top. You will probably notice that I'm using pine blocks rather than MDF blocks for this, but that's only because we drilled the MDF blocks wrong the first time, so we had to go to plan B. Adding on to that, we also made the blocks 40mm thick rather than 25mm thick like we planned, and that was just for greater stability. So if you were wondering why we changed, that's the reason why. Right, so going back to drilling through the Kallax top, you want the screws to go through from bottom to top, and then into the centre of the wooden blocks. And you want 2 screws per wooden block. To make sure all of the holes are the same distance from the edges, we made a jig from scrap wood, and used that to add a hole in each corner. You want to create 4 clearance holes in the Kallax top, and corresponding pilot holes into the 2 wooden blocks. So once a hole had been added to each corner, I then attached this top piece to the Kallax. Oh, and don't forget you need to paint those wooden blocks as well. I also added 4 pre-bought inserts to the Kallax, 2 cupboard doors and 2 sets of drawers. Okay, so we're on the home straight now, we're nearly there, and the next thing to do is to arrange the units in the room that this table is going to go in. As you can see, I arranged them so that there would be a gap on one side, where I could sit and have my legs under the table. Then it's time for the finishing touches. So we drill wood screws up through the holes inside the Kallax and up through the holes in the wooden blocks to secure them in place. I used posi-drive wood screws approximately 75mm long. And again, remember to not tighten the screws too much. We added a washer to each of these screws so that we didn't damage the plastic coating on the inside of the Kallax. And then all that's left to do is add the tabletops. Since I bought the 2 tabletops, all I have to do is attach them together to make sure they don't move apart. I'm not going to attach the tabletops directly to the units, as they're heavy enough to not move easily anyway. I cut out a couple of pieces of plywood that I already had, and drilled a couple of clearance holes into them. Luckily, the tabletops I bought already had screw plates embedded into the underside, so I made use of these. If you don't have these, you'd obviously just need to drill holes into the underside of the tabletop, making very sure not to drill or screw through to the top of the tabletop. I simply chose screws that fit into the screw plates and would only go halfway through the thickness of the tabletops. I then screwed the plywood sections on, one at each end of the tabletops, so that each of them straddle the central join. Then it's time to fill your units with lovely stuff and feel so much more organised. I have to say that because we've never made furniture before, I didn't have high hopes, but I'm really pleased with the result. It's huge, it fits a lot of stuff inside, and the white finish matches with the white Kallax that I bought. So all in all, I am very happy with it. I really hope that you've enjoyed seeing this project come to life, and thank you very much for watching.